Kate, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Hi, thank you. It's lovely to be here. Hi, hello, Michael. It's lovely to see you.
Um, so, for those of you who have not attended before, the way that we do the Q&A is to use the Q&A box. If you look down on the bottom and click the button that says Q&A, you'll get a dialog box that pops up, and you can type your questions into there, and I will ask them as they come through. Please don't put them in the chat box, and please don't raise your hand because we can't see you, and it won't register at all. So just go press Q&A button and then type your question into there, and I will try to get to as many questions as I can. So Kate, that was such a wonderful question to listen to. Again, I got to experience it live, and I've now watched it 2 or 3 times in its edited version, and I find more and more there each time. One of the things I love about it is, the way all 4 of you are trying to sort of open up this conversation about translation, about what it is, about what constitutes translation, about what translation means, about what situations a translation is legitimate. And I just get so excited about that. And I was thinking, one thing you and I were talking beforehand about one of my favorite novelists, Javier Marias from Spain, who, I think all of his protagonists are translators, and in one form or another. And one of my favorite book by him, Heart So White, he has a translator who is working at the highest levels, like translating for sovereigns and prime ministers and presidents. And the level of mistrust is so high that they actually have an interpreter behind the interpreter who's there to police his interpretation, to make sure that he doesn't make a mistake or say something untoward or dishonest. And the protagonist of the book, a male translator, turns around and sees that his second translator is a woman that he finds attractive. And so in order to sort of test this attraction, he makes a deliberate mistake in his interpretation, and to see if she will cover for him. And in fact, she does. And this establishes this bond between these two that eventually grows into a romantic bond that at the same time becomes the seed of mistrust that later devolves into, jealousy and all kinds of things. And the word in the Spanish version that he uses a lot to talk about translation is vínculo, which means link or tie or bond, and how he examines the way that translation sets up these links or these bonds or these ties between, in this case, 2 people in a romantic relationship, but also between the translator and the person that he's translating, and the translator and the reader, or the translator and the listener. And I couldn't help thinking about, so much of what you guys were talking about was the way that translation establishes these kinds of bonds between people in all these different situations. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Wow, yeah, that's an amazing question to start with, Michael. Thank you. Yeah, it makes me think. I think my head goes first to a project that's live, actually, by a friend of mine who's based in Switzerland, who's a philosopher of translation. His name is Arno Renken, and he has this project called Traduction en Relation, translation relation. And he would argue, and I know this because I've translated some of his work into English, an article he wrote recently, that translation, that's what it does. It's productive of relations in the ways that you describe, kind of, complex, particular, specific sorts of relations between texts, obviously, but also between people. And I think that's something I've found in this process, like this kind of in the wake of the prize, and being asked to sort of to dream up some kind of event that spoke to my practice and to translation more generally, was that this sense of having a relation already with Sawako, with John, with Johannes, like through reading their work and sometimes teaching their work, engaging with their work, but then having the chance to kind of converse with them and talk with them and feel, although we translate in such different ways, in such different manners, materials and contexts and languages, there's something that I think, there's something particular about each of those relations, like with those particular individuals and their works, but there's something about, I guess, what translators know. It's not a kind of solid, stable body of knowledge, but there's a sense of you mentioned a kind of intimacy that can be, that can form. There's just a sense of I think translators know certain kinds of things. They have, they have access to certain forms of knowledge which maybe other kinds of practices don't have. And so it does. I think we know what it is. I guess we know what durationally it is to write a translation. There is a kind of intimacy there when you meet another translator, and like, we're doing very different things and we're working in different ways and we might disagree, but we have this sense of like, we know what it is to do this work. And I definitely felt that with the three of them. And I feel that in my life, like, when I come across other translators, certainly when I talk with other translators of Roland Barthes, for example, I feel like, yeah, we've been through the same pages, together. And for sure, there's a special sort of relationship that gets formed.
Mm. So the first question we have from the audience in the Q&A box is from Megan. Hi, Kate. Thanks to you and your translator colleagues for a wonderful event. I was really interested in what you said about the role of permission giving and risk taking in the work of translation. How do you cope with the fear involved in contemplating and beginning and completing a translation project? Has it gotten easier over time?
Oh, thank you. That's a very apt and timely, pertinent question. It's interesting. I was translating kind of constantly for about sort of 5 years when I was working on the Bart lectures, and then I stopped. I've had this hiatus from, well, I feel like in a way I've been translating loosely and kind of in a kind of my own expanded fashion when I was writing This Little Art, which is a kind of translation of those lecture courses, and also when I've been working for the last sort of 4 years on another book, which is also a kind of translation of those lecture courses, but in a very indirect way. But I haven't been translating in that sense of writing, of taking on the kind of responsibility for representing someone else's work in English, and except I've just started doing this again with a novel by a writer called Hélène Bessette called Lily Pleur, and I've been working on an excerpt of this translation and feeling again that sense of excitement and kind of energy, but also responsibility and anxiety and what it is. I think for me, I think not only for me, I think many translators would identify with this, is that coming down on a decision, wanting to kind of hold open the possibilities for as long as you possibly can, to the point where I'm going to be publishing an excerpt of this translation, and I've included the underlinings of these points, these sort of nodes in this very short set of pages, where it all still feels kind of undecided to me. I think, yeah, perhaps, I mean, I can know, like with the translation project, at a certain point you do need to come down, you do need to make decisions. That's part of your work. You say, I choose this, not that. But I think to sort of hold off that moment, which is a kind of fearful, anxiety producing moment, I try and stay in this space of like, it's temporarily this. Let's say, let's like go with this now, with the sort of proviso that it could potentially be corrected, which of course it could by another translator in the future, or by myself in the future. Yeah. Mm. I don't know if it gets easier. That's a short answer, is it doesn't get easier. That's what I'm finding. Sorry.
Well, one of the things that I kept hearing too was, there was a great part earlier in the conversation where you guys were talking about like mistrust of the translator, and the translator is the collaborator. And, I feel like the translator, kind of sits in this borderland between, not only between like yourself and your own thoughts and the writer that you're translating, but between sort of, the artisan who's just, working on language, and the creative artist who's transforming that language. And I wonder, like, how, like, when do you feel yourself kind of slip over from like one side of the border to the other? Like, when do you decide, like, I'm no longer translating Roland Barthes, I'm writing This Little Art, or now I'm translating this thing. Like, at what point did you feel like, one side or the other of that takes over for you?
I mean, I think that space that you've called like so beautiful, like this borderland space, is the space I'm interested in kind of just living in, actually. And maybe it is a kind of tilty kind of space which tips one way or another. I think for me, like the limit, the decision, like there was obviously I'm very invested in the idea of there being continuity between different forms of writing and translation being a writing practice, among others. I think the threshold for me happens around space, around room. I think, you know, the translation of like How to Live Together, say like Comment Vivre Ensemble, that published translation was trying to match the original lecture notes spatially, you know, in terms of quantity. So, you know, a note would be produce a note, and like one of Bart's notes, short elliptical notes, would produce an elliptical note in English in my translation. Where I feel like I'm tipping over into a different form of writing or giving myself more license or space is when I give myself more room. So I think this little art was like a kind of effort to sort of claim more room for the thoughts, like a space to put the kind of thinking that I was doing while producing those translations, and where I wasn't beholden anymore to this this rule, this sort of quantitative limit, which is, you know, that's not my idea. That's something I talk about in this little art. Like Jacques Derrida has a kind of position on this, about this, about translations more or less matching in terms of volume. And I think that's true. I think that's what makes a translation hard and interesting and constrained as a practice, is that you're trying to match volume for volume. And yeah, I guess in these other books that sit alongside the translations, there's this sort of claiming of a different sort of volume for myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So we have an audience question. I'm wondering if you can tell us about your journey to becoming a translator. It seems like such a challenging and interesting job.
Wow. Well, thank you for the question. It was an indirect journey. I think the short version, is that I think quite early on, I wanted to try and make a life for myself where reading and writing would be sort of the key activities. And as a student, I think as a BA undergraduate student, I thought, well, if I get a grant, I'll do a master's degree, and that will allow me to continue on. And if I, you know, and then I was at the time in the 90s in the UK, it was possible to get grants to do PhDs. And if I get a grant, I'll do a PhD. So I kind of stayed in the institution of the university for through my 20s, happily, and reading a lot in French and thinking about sort of big questions. And but I became quite frustrated, I guess, for myself with the sort of forms that were available to me to sort of write and think in within a kind of academic context. And at the same time, a friend of mine who was also like a young academic was working under Etienne Balibar, who's a French philosopher, who proposed to this friend a translation project, who then, and this friend who's Italian then proposed to me to sort of help with this translation project because it was working into English. And I started sort of working on this translation. I discovered in translation this other way of working, or another kind of form of reading and writing, that actually wouldn't sustain me financially in terms of you know, building a career. I've never supported myself professionally as a translator. I've always taught in different contexts as my main kind of income source. But it was sort of translation was like a way of sort of doing the sort of thinking I wanted to do and engaging with the kinds of texts I wanted to do in a way that felt I could exist outside of the institution. And indeed, when I was working on those big translation projects, the Roland Barthes translation projects, they were a way for me of working from home, because I had I had my first child, and yeah, sort of finding a manner of existing intellectually and creatively that sort of didn't depend on the institution anymore. It depended on other things, obviously, like publishers and stuff, but not the institution. Yeah. So that, I mean, that wasn't that short answer, but yeah.
Well, here's a follow-up from another audience member. How do you decide what to translate?
Wow, I think that's a very like a fascinatingly complex question. Like, who decides who decides what to translate, who, you know, whether that's a decision that's actually made by the translator. Often there's a whole other number of factors that come into play, sort of in terms of who gets kind of validated as a translator and enabled to do the work of translation, particularly when you factor in questions like pay and the fact that it's not materially supported, particularly as a profession. In terms of me personally, because of the fact that, as I said, you know, I also have a kind of practice, a kind of profession as an educator, and that's where I earn a living. It's meant that I've been more free to invest a great deal of time in certain kinds of projects and also not translate for a while. And then now translating this novel from the 1950s, which is a kind of lineated, it's wild kind of poem of a novel. The decision comes from, I guess, my own just excitement and like kind of the energy that I get from this writer's prose and her risk taking, and I feel like it's something I could really learn from, and that I think would speak to other readers with a kind of sensibility, a kind of reading sensibility like mine. But I think actually that question of who translates what and when and what timings of their lives, it's like there are factors, it's like this kind of complex of issues and questions, and it's a very unsimple decision, I think.
Well, you know, I'll follow up with that about with the decision to translate Bart, right? I mean, as somebody who, you know, went through graduate school probably at the same time you did, you know, much of our curriculum revolved around like 5 or 6 French philosophers of a certain generation, you know, Bart among them, and you know, you're not translating, you know, the canonical works there. You know, you're translating lectures and unfinished works and stuff. And I wonder if you could talk about like what drew you to those specifically, you know, as you know, needing to be translated as part of his, you know, ongoing, you know, presentation in English.
Well, I think there were 2 things, partly to do with the sort of kinds of questions that he was asking in those late works. Then, I mean, the first one I translated, which was actually the last one, so it's out of sequence, is a lecture course about the novel, and is about under what conditions might it be possible for someone like Roland Barthes, he's the protagonist of this lecture course, to write a novel today. And this is in the late 1970s. And then he begins to sort of set out, it's a weird sort of conceptual project, you know, like a take on what a lecture course could be, like to sort of transmute this private fantasy of novel writing into staging it as a public lecture course in the setting of the Collège de France, so in this prestigious setting. It's this kind of extraordinary, like performative project. I found it just, and it was a course, it was teaching, but it was teaching as a way of sort of unfolding a fantasy. You know, his starting point is that in teaching such as this, one must locate a fantasy. And I guess translating it was a way of, I found the whole project fascinating, and it was a way of taking that course. It was a way of being a student of that course, like, you know, however many years, 50, 60 years after the fact. So that was, and then through working on that course and then coming to the first course, which was called How to Live Together, you know, questions of forms of community, how to sort of improvise or invent or fantasize a form of community that wouldn't cause suffering, but would actually, in which an individual could live at their own rhythm without impacting or crushing or, you know, harming anyone else. Like, these questions seem to me just, they still seem to me to be just kind of vital, essential questions. And translation was a way of staying with them, you know, staying with them for a long period of time. And I guess I'm still with them, you know, they're still sort of animating my work. So, but it obviously did feel intensely audacious at the time to think that it really was a pitch. It was like a wild pitch. I knew that these lecture courses were being translated. Rosalind Krauss and Denis Ollier had translated Le Neutre, the neutral. I'd done this previous translation for MIT. I had some sort of credibility, I thought maybe, but it was like this wild, you know, will you take a chance on me doing this? And I had to do a sample and have that vetted and all of that stuff. But I'm very glad, obviously, that I did get that opportunity, because it was life-changing.
One of our audience members asks, who are some of your favorite contemporary translators besides your co-panelists? Ha ha.
Well, totally. My co-panelists. Oh, there's a lot. I feel like if I start naming names, I'll leave people out. I'm thinking, well, someone people I correspond with, whose work I admire, Jennifer Croft is a translator, and these are translators who also publish with Fitzcarraldo, for example, Jen Kelleher, Don Choi, an extraordinary translator. There's a translator from the Dutch called Sophie Collins, who also writes, theorizes about translation, who's also a poet, who produced this extraordinary anthology called Currently an Emotion, which is this set of poetic translations and commentary on what it is to translate poetry, which is this, something I return to often. There are a lot. I'm worried that I'm not named enough names. What's wonderful is it feels that translators are increasingly gaining visibility and sort of agency within the kind of publishing literary culture, and speaking about their own practices, which of course, very different, and their own specific contexts, which are obviously very different to mine.
I'm going to jump back. I had a follow-up earlier that I was thinking about, related, partly to what you guys were talking about in the conversation. There's a moment in that conversation where that I found very moving and somewhat surprising, was to hear John Keane talk about his fear of the limits of his own knowledge, and that sense of like, do I bring enough? Like, do I feel confident enough in myself as a person who is or as a translator, or as a speaker of another language, to actually presume that I can bring this work over into another language? And I wonder, if you could talk about that struggle for you. Like, at what point did in your studies and in your journey to becoming a translator, where did you start to feel confident about this, and how did you overcome whatever that fear is?
I found it intensely enabling, to hear John speak to that, because it's something that certainly I feel as well. But I think, and there's something I was trying to sort of argue for around the kind of figure of the amateur translator in this little art, is to say, I don't think that knowledge, the knowledge that is required to translate some, a work produced by someone else, is not given in advance, I think, for any translator. I think I think translation is a knowledge producing, sort of knowledge seeking process, and it's in the doing of it that we understand, and we get nervous and and concerned about how much we learn what we don't know, but we also learn what it is that we need to find out, or to sensitize ourselves to, or the people that we need to ask, the kind of resources that we need to deploy in order to be capable of translating it. So I think knowledge and learning happens through the process of doing it, which is what one of the kind of arguments of the book, or the invitations of the book, was to say, like, translation can start. We can all start translating with minimal knowledge and kind of sketchy expertise and in amateurism, and it's almost like the process of doing it will teach us, if we're responsive, the process of doing it will teach us what we need to learn. And I believe that fundamentally, I guess, because I believe that from experience, that there was in no way that I had the competence to translate the works. Even, it's now like starting on a whole new, the work of a writer who I admire so much, and this woman, Hélène Bessette, who I'm so excited to translate. I haven't, I read as much as I can of her books, her 13 novels. I'm in no way yet competent to translate her work. It's going to be something that happens, I hope, through the process of doing
it. There's been a conversation going on in the chat box asking the name of a philosopher you mentioned earlier. Was it Ranke?
Oh, Arno Renken, R-E-N-K-E-N. He has a book called Babel Heureux, which is not in English yet, but he has this project called Translation Relation. He's based in Switzerland, and he's a really, really extraordinary thinker and person and practitioner of translation. Yeah.
So you're working on, you're just about done with a new book as well, the long form. Is there anything you want to tell us about that?
Only that it's nearly there. It is nearly there. It's finally nearly there. I've worked out that it takes me about 5 years to write a book. It seems like I thought it might go faster, like having figured something out, and I realized it doesn't. But yeah, it's nearly there, and it is a kind of, in a way, an engagement. It's a book of thinking about what a novel is. So in a sort of indirect manner. So it is still engaged with those last lectures by Roland Barthes, but it doesn't actually cite Roland Barthes once. That's, so at the moment, in its current form, it did in earlier forms. Like that presence was everywhere, and I've slowly sort of become more like subterraneous, that thinking.
I'm interested in the titles of your books. You put a lot, you put these very sort of, common everyday modifiers to enormous, you really work them hard and to great effect. And I wonder what it is about those little tiny adjectives that attracts you so much. Little and long.
Yeah. I did actually, there was an earlier sort of ventured title I remember sort of exchanging with Jacques Testard, who's my editor at Fitzcarraldo. I was saying, hey, what about the world in small doses? Because that's a phrase from Winnicott, who I've been reading a lot, and Jacques was like, that you can't have this little art and then the world in small doses. It's like there's too much. Like he didn't actually say that. He was like kind of maybe, but maybe it was me who was sort of policing that. I think long. I mean, I've just had this sort of chance of making a conversation in print with Renee Gladman, who you know obviously, and sort of exchanging.
I think she's here.
Is she here?
I believe so.
Well, that was like just one of the best things I've ever done, and talking with her, I mean, in this live way that we sort of fashioned to do it together, and we had this sort of set of reflections around what long means. I think for me, yeah, it's duration. This book is about duration. It's about forms of living together. It's over time. It's about it's about holding, which is a term from Winnicott, like what it is to kind of hold something together, or let something to collapse and then pick it back up again and sort of hold it again, or let it find a new configuration. So I guess I think my problem in a way, or something I often get frustrated with myself about, or why this should be the case, is I am very interested in abstraction. I mean, I do abstraction. I know, like the long form is such like an abstract, like, or form, like what do we, art, like translation, like what are we even talking about? And I think what I try and do in my work is just sort of make these shifts, or these translations, I guess, from this plane of abstraction of the biggest ideas, which are the things that excite me. What do we mean when we talk about form? I get very excited about sort of questions that, like, phrased in that way with that vocabulary, but then to try and sort of translate them and make them particular and make them lived and situated, and then from those situations sort of open the questions again. I mean, Renee was talking about pulsing and about beats and about rhythm, all things which like just matter a lot to me.
Well, I think we're running out of time, Kate. Thanks so much for being here. Before everybody takes off, I want to tell you a couple of things. First of all, Kate and Renee and all of this year's prize recipients are going to be featured in an upcoming issue of the Yale Review, which should be out in early December. And we're having an incentive to have people show up to our live sessions, which is if you fill out the Google Doc, which they dropped into the chat box here that says fill out this form to receive a free copy of the Yale Review. So if you click on that link, put in your name and your mailing address, you'll get a free copy of the Yale Review just for having attended today. I should also say that next week, we are going to be featuring Dion Brand. And that is our penultimate event of the festival. And we're going to finish up 2 weeks from today with a keynote address from U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. So really hope you can join us for those. Joy has also actually agreed to, after the address to do a Q&A session like this, so you can join us and ask some questions of her at that event. And I also wanted to say, just on your last point, Kate, there's one of the things that we've been doing at the festival is if you go on the platform, there's a lot of on-demand content, including conversations about specific objects that we chose from Yale's art and library collections. And one of them was an essay on form by George Eliot that Kate actually found in our libraries and selected for us. And there's a really interesting conversation that Kate and several of her fellow recipients have around this manuscript of George Eliot's about form that I would encourage you all to go check out. So Kate, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. I wish you the best of luck with your writing and your translating and all your projects going forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone who was here. Thank you. And thank you to John and Sawako and Johannes and Renee. And yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's amazing. Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.